Yeah. So, good morning. Abdul Filali Ansari asked me to moderate this session. I hope I succeeded. So today maybe we will come back to some literature, at least briefly. But before paving the way to Kevin Reinhart, I will give the floor to Abdul Filali Ansari. He wants to say something to you.
Good morning again. Just to say a little caution, if I may, about something that we may not be aware of. It happens to us in this kind of discussion to use the same words, but to have in mind different things. And this is something that may make some difficulties in discussions. So I wanted to take an example, for example, that of a mosque and a church. Yesterday they came in discussions a lot, and colleagues thought that we were talking more or less of parallel things into traditions or two religions. Mm-hmm. Although for us, when we say a mosque, we think most of the time of a building, a place where people worship. Yeah. And for Muslims, we know that we don't need mosques, in fact, all the time. We can, all the earth, all the planet is a mosque in a way. But when we say a church, it's not only a building and it's a community. When we say that the Lutheran church or Calvinist church, it means at the same time the place where people worship, but also something else. It means also the community of those who belong. It would be rather a tariqa for Muslims, tariqa or something like that. So here just a little, I think we will dedicate a long time, all the time nearly today to look at these questions where it may be possible sometimes to dissipate rather than solve problems, to dissipate misunderstandings. Rather, this is what I wanted to say. Just a little caution before we start today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filali Ansari. I mean, in my sense, one of the benefits of these presentations is that they push me or push us to dig more in document, in history of Islam. I mean, regardless of being Muslim or not, but they are an invitation to know more. It's a challenge, but it's also a must. So please, Kevin Reinhart, the floor is yours.
Feeling fresh and excited. I have to say, we've worked hard the last couple of days, and this morning, to my horror, which this never happens, I woke up and then fell asleep again. And that is a measure, I think, of how hard we're working and how engaging all of this is, at least for me. For you, perhaps it's boring or irritating or whatever, but for me, anyway, it's exciting and even a little bit thrilling. So a certain amount of what we were talking about is indeed terminology, and I'll repeat the terminology, really are tools. So Dr. Filali Ansari's observation on the term church is a great one, and I need reminding because, of course, when in my field, when we use the term church, we're drawing particularly on Durkheim, who describes the church as the moral community that's created by the commitments that people make. Now, Durkheim was actually Jewish, or had been Jewish, let's say, but he was speaking and writing in French, rather good French, actually, rather elegant French, it seems, to this person who's perhaps not equipped to judge. So those of us who are interested in kind of sociological topics tend to just transmute that term to, when we talk about Islam, to talk about the mosque. And we don't mean, yes, exactly, we don't mean a building. We mean the moral community of Muslims in general, insofar as they form a single community. I mean, in some ways, it would be parallel to the word ummah, right? But of course, when I'm talking to people who don't know about Islam, to talk about the ummah is, you know, to introduce a complication. So I want to do just a bit of that. By popular request, it's so thrilling when students actually ask to talk about terminology. I want to talk about terminology a little bit to explain some of the terms that are just simply now basic in Islamic studies. So, you know, when these terms I'm going to introduce are simply commonplace in German, in French, in English, when we talk about the study of Islam, and they all come from Marshall Hodgson's great work, The Venture of Islam. The Venture of Islam was a 3-volume work. It was published posthumously. He hadn't quite finished it. He was one of the first people to go to be a jogger, and every day he went jogging. And he was out on the Midway in Chicago jogging with actually a friend of mine in 1968, and he died of a heart attack. And so two of his students basically gave up their careers to bring his manuscript that he'd been writing since the 1950s into shape, and it was finally published in the middle of the 1970s, and it transformed the field of Islamic studies. And the reason for this is that Hodgson meticulously thought through all of the assumptions that were embedded in the Euro-American study of Islam, and in many cases blew them up. And there was a lot of resistance, particularly from the British, who being asked to do something new is really a huge challenge. And so it's taken about 20 years now, 30 years, for these terms to become commonplace, but they are commonplace. There's some resistance to their use still, but I think that they are tremendously valuable analytically. So it's a pleasure to do what I do with my students at university, and that is to introduce you to the core terms. There are a lot of technical terms that he has. He doesn't use the word Middle East, for example. He talks about the Nile to Oxus region and so on. But these are core terms that are really sort of central, and perhaps you'll find them useful. So the first term is Islamic, and this refers only to religion in the proper sense, the religious sense, right? As I said in my first lecture, the whole question of the term is religion is quite a complicated one. I see it as simply a term that, you know, roughly describes the things we're interested in, and the key concept there is simply transcendence. In other words, this world is not all there is. There's more than this world. And so Islamic it refers to engagement with the transcendent in a distinctive way. Now he distinguishes, and this is the important part, between Islamic and Islamicate. And Islamicate is the culture centered on a lettered tradition which has been historically distinctive of Islamdom, and which is naturally shared by both Muslims and non-Muslims who participate at all fully in the society of Islamdom. The Islamdom I'll define in a minute. For this I've used the adjective Islamicate. Now, this is a very powerful term. Let me see if I've got no, that's on the next page. Okay, so Islamicate refers to those things that, you know, we blur the lines too much if we talk about, let's say, a palace as an Islamic building. A palace is an expression of political power. Of course, these things bleed over into each other, right? There are Islamic norms of power, Islamic norms of power. There are also Islamicate norms of power, which are not necessarily the same thing. So in Egypt in the 1400s, for example, to rule required, first of all, that one be a Kipchak Turk, right? And that you have gone through a period of training, first as a slave, a kol, and then to be integrated into a Mamluk household, and then eventually to begin playing the political game. So that, of course, was never a part of the Moroccan political tradition, as far as I know. And so we would refer to that as the Islamicate political theory of Mamluks in Egypt. I'll give you examples on the next page a bit more. But let me just give you the term that seems to have caused some controversy, and that is Islamdom. And that is simply the society in which Muslims and their faith are recognized as prevalent and socially dominant. A complex of social relations which, to be sure, is territorially more or less well defined. It does not then duplicate the essentially juridical and territorial term Dar al-Islam, yet in contrast to Muslim lands, which is you'll find a lot in European literature in the old days, it is clearly collective, not just one place, and this is frequently an important point. So, Islamdom refers to the world in which Muslims form the culturally dominant group. And these distinctions give us tremendous amount of power, I think, to precise the phenomenon we're describing. Now, of course, there's a kind of pedantry, a kind of, I think, what shall we call it, exaggeration, in which people focus, too much on terminology. They don't see it as a tool, they see it as like a law. And so the question is, is this really Islamic or is it really Islamicate? And there are these border cases, and what about like inheritance law? Is that Islamic or Islamic? And the answer is, well, of course all of these things, the boundaries between them are fuzzy because they're notional, right? We're inventing these words to allow us to analyze things. But we don't have, as our friend pointed out, we're missing the gentleman who's the sociolinguist, but as he's pointed out, we don't have a phenomenon that we can observe precisely in the way that we do with, let's say, the biome, to look at animals, let's say, and we can look now with DNA and so on and see whether this is really more of a cat or it's more of a kind of a dog or a wolf or something. Is it more of a wolf or is it more of a dog? These are things we can say precisely. These terms don't admit of that kind of precision. And that's okay, right? That's just what we do because we're dealing with a world that is complex and that is not, well, this is again, again what the Germans call the Geisteswissenschaft, the things that have to do with spirit, right? With concepts, with ideas, with human beings, essentially, as opposed to the Naturwissenschaften, which are, nature, mathematics, things like that. All right, so examples. Oh, that's so... Okay, Islamic, we would say, Malik's Muwatta is an Islamic book. Al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin is an Islamic book. Okay? And I think that's not complicated. It has to do with the domain of transcendence, right? How to be a good Muslim. By contrast, Islamicate refers to culture and cultural products and persons who participate in Islamdom. So the Royal Palace of Fez, which is what we have down below, is a product of Islamicate culture. It is an Islamicate building. It is Islamicate architecture. But also, Maimonides, Ibn Maimun, was a great Islamicate Jewish philosopher. Why? Because he read and debated with other, Muslim texts, right, written in Arabic. So he was reading Ibn Sina, or whoever. He was reading Farabi, certainly. And so, unlike Europe, where Jews were excluded from intellectual life, in Islamdom, right, Jews participated in the intellectual life of Islamicate society. They were allowed to learn Arabic. They criticized. They debated. Right? And so we want to recognize that, and to be accurate then, we don't say that he's a Jewish philosopher, right? Because he's not just living in this little bubble, right? He is shaped and formed by his reading, engagement with, debates with, and so on, Muslims. right? So in that case, it's powerful to use the term Islamicate. And finally, Islamdom, the example I gave the other day, I'll repeat. Northern India under the Mughal emperor, where Muslims were a minority but were socially dominant, was Islamdom, right? So we can say that Muslims were always a minority, but within, I don't know, 50 years of Babur coming to India, everybody is wearing the dress that Muslims wear. The influence, a friend of mine has shown the influence of usul al-fiqh and nahu discussions on commentaries on the great Indian grammarian Panini, right? So it's kind of the dominant culture in that sense, right? It sort of takes over. Now, we can also say that the Maghrib al-Aqsa was part of Islamdom under Mullah Idris. It seems that Muslims were a minority in Morocco, probably for the first 200 years or at least, of Islam's presence in Morocco, but it was quickly dominant. It was quickly the driving culture, for good reasons and bad reasons, one has to say. But again, everyone, particularly the native inhabitants, but also the immigrants, conformed to the norms that were brought by Muslims. Similarly, Persia, or Iran, probably now we think was not majority Muslim until somewhere in the 1100s, at least, at the earliest. But under Harun al-Rashid, who was in the 800s, the Muslims were absolutely culturally dominant, and Christian literature and Jewish literature shows its engagement with Muslim literature, right? Fictional, poetic, but also religious literature. So you have literally books on Christian Sharia. What's that about? Well, what it's about is Christians engaging with Muslims. And now there's a lot of terrific work on the shaping of Iraqi Jewish culture in this period by their encounter with mutakallimin and with usuliyin and so on and so forth. So it's really, Gregor Schwab, for example, in Germany works on this. So I guess the question is, what needs clarification at this point? Do these terms make sense to you? So I've given you a handout which is actually copped from, copped means stolen, from the printed version of Venture of Islam. So you can read it, you can see that Hodgson's prose, it's a good thing to read if perhaps late at night you're having trouble sleeping. It's very complex. It's not bad prose, but it's not good prose either, but it's very precise prose, very scholarly prose. And it's worth reading, but when you first sit down, in my case as a graduate student, and you have these 3 volumes of Marshall Hodgson in front of you and you think, oh my God, I have to get through that. The hard thing for me, it turned out, was it was so exciting. It was like fireworks were going off on every page. And my first copy is so full of annotation from this excited, 22-year-old dope, who was, oh, this is like this and this is like this. Now I go back and look at it and it's cute, but it's unbearable. So I had to buy a whole new set of 3 more volumes so that I can read the book again because it's sort of unbearable. Is this a hint? Have I,
No.
Is my voice ratchety? Okay, so any questions about Hodgson and this terminology and its applicability or challenges? I mean, there are certainly people who push back. Shahab Ahmed, for example, completely denies that the term Islamicate has any value. I think, well, he's wrong, but you're free to make the case.
Yes, please.
Rather a comment, if you want. Well, for Muslims, this distinction, especially between Islam and Islamdom, is so important because it reflects something that creates big troubles for them. If I can say, while we use one term when we are talking about the Muslim heritage, we use many when talking about other traditions. For example, we use the same term Islam in our everyday speech, to go back and forth between two realms which are very different one from each other. One is that of religion, beliefs, rituals, and so on, and that is history. And this creates huge problems, because when you go to, when you have one word to refer to both areas, then great confusions can come out of that. Because you can take, for example, the caliphate as being, this is the argument of Ali Abd al-Razak, who didn't read, I'm sure, Hodgson, but his argument is that the caliphate could not be Islamic in the same sense of as monotheism, for example. It's not a dogma. It's something that came in the history of Muslims. Muslims at some point in their history have chosen to go for this option, while there were other options. They eliminated, when one prevailed, it was the one of the caliphate. So we should not consider the caliphate as being part of Islam or being an obligation for Muslims. And much later, again, without reading Hodgson, I think it's something that is there, not only in concepts and terms and so on. The other who went to something like that is Abdul Majid Sharfi, who made a clear distinction, and I think very important one, because for Muslims it is important to abide by one dogma, that is, Muhammad is the last of prophets. With him is a seal of prophecy, with him happens the seal of prophecy, and no prophecy would come after him. So this means that any new wahi or any new inspiration from God wouldn't come, that with him we have the last of the forms of inspiration. So how can we, and the humanity is after him, is left to itself, if I can say. No guidance from God, no direct guidance. So how are we to handle this dogma? For Abdul Majid Sharfi, Muslims have been, until now, handling it in a very curious way. They have been, if I can say, like some people who find themselves in a building, they close on it, it's the seal of prophecy, but remain inside the views and so on. But if we were to take it seriously, we should understand that now that humanity is on its own, it should guide itself by its reason. So it should rather go out of the building, look at it from the outside, and do what we are doing now, if I may. So, and then decide for itself on reason, on what is reasonable for it to do, not what is the tradition. It's not a dead tradition, the dead hand of tradition. This is an expression that Hodgson, I think, discusses in detail, that for Muslims, the traditions should not be a dead hand. It should be rather something to be maybe to take inspiration from, but to get out of. This is the meaning of end of a seal of a, well, this is why I think it is important not only to take it as a category from, if I can say, scholarship from academia, but to take it as something that better reflects something on the ground, something that is there. For example, in our use every day, we never make a link between the massacres of Saint Bartholomew in Paris, where never a link between them and the Christian faith. Whenever you find the people discussing them, they will immediately see them and discuss them as something that happened in the history of Christianity. Never saying that Jesus said this, so he is responsible for these crimes, for killing thousands of Protestants in Paris over one night. While when it happened for 9/11, for example, everyone, or nearly everyone, made a link with Islam, with its tenets, with dogmas and so on. And we found many, and it was so here I think it would be very useful to keep this in mind, not only for academic reasons, but also for more, if I can say, reasons of everyday life, for reasons of honesty also.
And of course, this is a great example also of the complication of these terms, because on the one hand, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was nakedly a political act. That is to say, he said Paris is worth, converting to Catholicism. But on the other hand, it was the Catholic dogma that it was simply incompatible. It was impossible conceptually to live with Protestants. So there's something in, if it's certainly not, it's nothing you'll find in the New Testament, but the philosophy of the Catholic Church, which was certainly a religious institution, viewed the other, capital O, as categorically, well, the other, and therefore you could kill them without conscience. Damuhum halal, right? And so 9/11 similarly, you know, of course it's all, you can't just say, oh, this is down to the Quran, but on the other hand, it's not down to, you know, Robespierre. I mean, it is still you know, something that that was done by Muslims, thinking or believing that this represented the tradition. And so how do we think about that? So for me, this is the power of other terminology, which is to say, in this case, that we have a small group, again, technical term, a cult, that is derived, grounded in Islam, but hardly representative of Muslims. So when we draw these lines, again, the blurriness sometimes, if we have a conscience, we have to recognize the complexity of taking things off. On the other hand, there's no doubt that in practical terms, Lenin was a bigger influence on Osama bin Laden than Muhammad, right? I would argue. So let's see. Okay, so are there any further discussions of these matters and any terminology? Please, you know, I'm happy to. I mean, really, academics are happy to bore people with terminology. So anytime you want to talk about terminology, I'm your guy. So please interrupt, ask for clarifications, and so on.
One of the complications, but it's not that I mean important, but it's that the Arabic version of these terms. I mean, we receive the Islamicate, but it's not that easy to translate it into Arabic. So it gives us, I mean, this work, it gives us the impression that, I mean, it's addressed firstly to European and American readers rather than, I don't know, Arabs or Muslim readers, I mean, talking or using Arabic. So, for example, by the way, we have translated the text recently. I mean, the Venture of Islam is available. I mean, it appeared in Beirut, in Lebanon, in 3 volumes. I do not remember exactly the translator, but it's.
Translation is a real disaster.
So I didn't even, I searched for a translation. I didn't know it had been translated.
Yeah. It's already translated. I mean, recently, but.
Well, it's very hard, but it's the same thing when people were talking about sort of jihad theory and so on and so forth. How do you translate the difference between fard al-ain, right, and fard al-kifaya?
Yeah.
So this is crucial in Khomeini and it's crucial in Osama bin Laden. But you can say, well, the obligation on the sufficiency, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So it just becomes an Arabic calque, right, in English.
Yeah.
So this is a problem. So I had a note, I thought it was on here, but I guess it disappeared from the slide. It has been translated into Turkish, and I was a little involved in that. And they just basically said, this is too hard. So they, for example, for Islamdom, they translated it as Dar-ul-Islam. But his whole point is that it's not, Dar-ul-Islam is a geographical concept. And he's interested in the moral community of Muslims and the culture of Islam. So they just basically threw up their hands. I don't know, I mean, ask me how to translate Islamicate into Arabic. Allahu A'lam. Huh? Al-A? Al-Aslama.
Islamization.
Yeah, so what you have to do, I mean, simply, sometimes translation has to use calques. So you could take Al-Aslama and say, from now on, this is going to be our representation in Arabic of the concept, and then he explains the concept, and you explain, and the reader recognizes that this is bad Arabic, but this is the term we're going to use, and so you create a new concept. And we do that all the time with things like computers and so on. We create new words in Arabic that don't make any sense, and then they make sense. I mean, what's husub? What's husub? What would that mean in 1950?
Maybe a good thing is to prepare a review of this translation. I mean, comparing it with the English version. I mean, do you have something to say, please?
Well, just that,
You'll hate me. Please don't make them do this.
well, just about the translation of terms and so on. I don't think that, well, we should see it as well, it is an obstacle, it is a problem. Translation is always a great problem, and those who try to do it or to translate and try to do it seriously feel that it is much more difficult than writing by oneself.
Oh, absolutely.
So this is and finding the right, but we are not, I think, compelled to find exactly the same, because it's not possible.
Right.
We are not. So it is possible, but however, it is possible to translate one word by a sentence or two sentences, or by, for example, for Islam, not Islamic, for Islam, I would say Tarikh al-Muslimin. I would use them, Siyaqat al-Muslimin, Siyaqat Muslim context. It's not Islam, but it's not very far. I think it is possible to build. And if I may, to come back to what I said just earlier, I took the example of the caliphate, which can be discussed among Muslims if we take these distinctions seriously. Can be discussed, I think, in positive ways, if they accept that these were experiments by Muslim communities into organizing themselves, following their principles, then it's okay. But if we take them as being something else, the other example I would take that this reflects on, and which is direct and very important. Here, I think scholarship can bring a lot to the understanding of Muslims of their own past. It's the idea of Sharia, of Islam being a Sharia, or a link between Islam. Although we know that, well, there are in the Quran, sacred texts and so on, there are commandments. But we, at the same time, know that the idea of a system of law that would encompass every aspect of life is not something that was there in the beginning. We know that it was Shafi'i who brought it in his Risala, which was written something nearly 200 years after the passing of the Prophet. So the idea of Sharia as a law that regulates the whole social and political order is something that came much later and is maybe part of the history of Muslims, not part of Islam as a religion. So these are things that I think clarifications that would be greatly useful if they were made seriously in Muslim context, and where really academic discourse can bring something to the understanding of the Muslims by themselves, of their own history by themselves. I'm sorry I have these problems of mine.
Well, I think, but on the other hand, and this is a useful thing for you all to think about as well, is the question that Ustaz Fuad raises, which is, yeah, well, if this term works so well, then how do you translate it into Arabic? And that you can't easily translate it into Arabic doesn't mean that it's invalid any more than Fard al-Kifaya is not a reasonable concept, even though it's difficult to express in English. But nonetheless, it keeps you humble. And one of the most irritating things is when people who don't think about language say, oh, he's just a translator, or he just does translations. And I really want to shoot those people. Because as you say, I think translating is, in many ways, harder than writing, right? Because you have to humble yourself to the text and to the language while being creative with your own language. It's very difficult. So all of you all are clearly gifted at language, and probably you'll be doing translations yourself. And I salute you, because there are things I've translated, and I've found that much harder than just sort of, expatiating. So.
Well, just another comment about the new concepts of Islamicate and Islamdom is how much widespread in terms of contemporary literature is. As scholars, we found problem to translate them into proper Arabic, or to find a fixed term for them. So do these terms make it fuzzy and I would say clumsy in terms of using them by like scholars who write about Islam and Islamic like heritage?
Well, no, I think they clarify things, and they've become commonplace. So, for example, a woman at Princeton who has a huge institute and she gives away lots of money for editing texts and translating texts. It's the Center for Islamicate Studies, and so on. So we just take this for granted because the utility is obvious once you accept his terminology. But the thing to recognize is Islamicate is not an English word either. He made it up, right? Islamdom, Christendom we have, yes, but he made up Islamdom. And so it becomes clear by usage. But I grant your point that, you know, especially initially when you translate it, or whatever translation you come up with, and it may not be just one word, then at first, yeah, it's difficult. But I think that not just English speakers have found these to be profoundly useful. And this text, by the way, has been translated into Turkish, but also into, and this tells you something, I could easily find translations into Chinese, Malaysian, Indonesian, Turkish. I know that, of course, the Iranians don't recognize copyright, but I know that it's available in Persian. I couldn't find an Arabic translation, so I was very interested. I used WorldCat and couldn't find it, so that's interesting.
We have another question.
Yes.
I
Sorry,
think-
did I answer your question?
I think that the problem at the Arabic level is along the Arab world, there is no agreement or there is no unification of certain terms. Like there are some scholars in the East, for example, who refer to the same term in English, but they refer to it in a different word than we refer to it here in the West.
Yes.
So I think that's the problem. So there should be a certain agreement over the meaning of a certain term along all the Arabian land, or the Muslim, as you said.
Good luck.
That's
I would
the
say
problem.
yes, of course, but what that means in reality is that you have to write a really good book, define the term the way you want, and then it'll take over. And you can see this not only in things like computers, but also in literary theory, right? That there's competition at first to figure out what's the best word for, I don't know what. Trying to think of a good example. To use an outre example, something like queer theory, right? Which for a certain period of time was important in literature. I think its day has passed.
Sorry?
So anyway, the point is only that you have to use it in such a way and then define it.
So, good morning. I'm just asking about these new words, for me at least. So, do you think that they were coined by Mr. Marshall Hodgson for purely academic purposes, or they bear some ideology behind them?
Again, I think that's a very good question, and of course, no one, lives. I mean, we're like fish. We're always in some kind of water, right? And that water is our worldview, and that reflects certain beliefs and so on. In Hodgson's case, he was criticized, and there's some vicious criticism of him because he was. This is again he's writing in the 1970s. He was critical of Israel. He was sympathetic to Muslims. He was himself quite religious. He was a Quaker himself, and in general, his kind of embrace of Islam, of the Islamic and Islamicate world, which is clear really on every page, was seen as being not objective. So yeah, I think Hodgson's world, part of what makes the book so powerful is he has such a powerful mind and conscience that he is, that's reflected in his work. But I guess what I would say is the world is full of books about Islam. It's maybe the last tradition that you can write about because you dislike it, right? It's not many people who write a book about Taoism, about Zhuangzi or something because they hate it and think it's stupid, right? But there are still people writing about Islam because they think that it needs correction. Hodgson is the opposite. So yes, of course, he's coming from a place, he's living in a certain world and all of that. You can move this along. Oh, another question. Yes, sir.
Okay, very shortly. I've been familiar with the word Christendom, but it's usually, for me, it's synonymous with the word abode of Islam, Dar al-Islam. You said in the presentation that it doesn't duplicate the same meaning. What is the difference between the two?
Well, so there are places, a good example would be Indonesia, you know, after the first merchants and missionaries sort of come in the 15th century. Islam had a place, they thought of themselves as Muslims, they had prayer and so on, but otherwise they were indistinguishable from other Indonesians. Or let's say Muslims in France. France is if you're a Muslim, I mean, it's explicitly not, I mean, Islam is not part of Dar al-Islam, I think we can agree, in the judicial sense of the term. But what's important to us is that it is also not part of Islamdom. The Muslims are not in a culturally dominant position. That could change. I mean, that's the great French fear, isn't it? How many people have told me, well, you know, the most common name for a young boy in London is Muhammad. Like, ooh, well, why not, you know? So the point is that Dar al-Islam has to do ultimately with political power. And it's not really about social power or cultural prominence. So the two can map onto each other. You know, Morocco is part of Dar al-Islam, it's also part of Islamdom. But what makes Morocco part of Islamdom is the cultural prominence of Muslims, Muslim values, Muslim discourse, and so on, and not the mere fact that there are Muslims here or that the king is a Muslim. Okay? Okay, so I want to talk in response to, this partly is shaped a little bit in response to our discussion last time, but I think that it builds on the discussion last time in ways that I hope you will find useful. And that is to continue our metaphor of language. Now, the term that I'm using in this is koine, which is not an everyday word that we use in English. But it's a very important concept. And to explain it, let me just give you a brief description of something. When Muslims or Christians describe the Bible as the equivalent of the Quran, they are wrong on many levels. They are not the same. But one core difference is that the Quran is understood to be the very words of God transcribed in the way that a parliamentary reporter takes down the words of debaters in a parliamentary discussion. So in other words, the Quran as it appears in the world appears with, you know, inna anzalnahu. That is not a translation of anything. Now, most contemporary Christians don't think about it very much, but the Bible's claim is rather different. The New Testament, in particular, has 4 different accounts of Jesus' mission, and crucially, it's written in a language that was not Jesus' language at all. Palestinian Jews at the turn of the Christian era spoke Aramaic, which is a Syriac language that's close to Syriac and pretty understandable if you know Arabic. The Gospels, on the other hand, were all written in Greek, but a special kind of Greek called Koine Greek. And we can see the distance between Jesus' speech and the accounts of it because words of Aramaic are occasionally dropped into the Greek text. So at one point when Jesus is dying, he is reported to say, Eli, Eli, or possibly Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is essentially, Allah, Allah, limada taraktani. Right? Also, when a deaf, mute man is brought to Jesus, he heals him by saying, be opened. And the text, the Greek text has ifata, which is iftah or infatah, right, in Arabic. So in other words, the text acknowledges that Jesus spoke Aramaic, when it quotes Aramaic to report Jesus' words. It calls attention to the fact that this is written in Greek. They're translations, they're historical accounts written by people who used Greek to write. Now, the reason for this is that the Christians were, from a very early period, certainly within, say, 50 years of Jesus' death, a missionary religion. And they wanted to use a language that was understood throughout the area that they lived in. And that language was Koine Greek. Now, Koine Greek was the Greek that was used by merchants, by politicians, by scientists, by administrators to communicate with other people within the Eastern Mediterranean era. Just as when you write, if you're French or Ukrainian, you write your software manuals in English. Now, when you read this English, if you're a native English speaker, it's often not sort of precisely English, but it is comprehensible, right? It is a distinctive form of English that's used for communicating among people who may not have as their home language English. And a good example of this is Arabic novels. Right? Arabic novels are written in Fusha. They have dialogue in Fusha. Now, I suppose there are some people who speak Fusha when they're talking to their beloved or when they're, talking to their mother or whatever. But if you want a novel to be read outside of Morocco, let's say, you don't write your novel entirely in Darija. Right? So, Koine Greek was that kind of language. It was the shared language that people used to communicate. It was a simplified language. But here's the important point. When we look at the Gospels, when scholars look at the Gospels, they can tell that the Gospel of Mark was written by somebody whose home language was Aramaic. There are certain peculiarities in the syntax, certain word choices that, only makes sense if you're thinking in Aramaic. Similarly, we can tell that the Gospel of Luke was written by somebody who was really familiar with, probably his home language was Koine and certainly Greek. So you know that this is true. When I meet a Russian scientist, for example, who's speaking English, I can tell where he learned his English, right? He learned it, the English model, or he learned the Russian model. In other words, if he says, "Oh, come upstairs to my room, we'll take the lift," I know that he studied on the English model. If he says, "Take the elevator," I know he studied on the American model, right? And also, of course, I can tell he's Russian because he says, "Upstairs I have some vodka," but upstairs, what he says is, "Upstairs I have some vodka," right? So the consonants change, the production of the rhythms of the sentence change. I can tell that he's a native Russian speaker. Now, there are many ways in which Koines operate in the world. Best example to me is India. India is the home to 70 different languages, 70 different languages. And frankly, there's a lot of linguistic nationalism about this. We tend to think of India as being about Hindi, but of course, if you're in the south, Malayalam is much more important, or Tamil, or Telugu, and they resent the Hindi-speaking people. Urdu used to function as an important language, but then it became nationalized and so became irrelevant in India. So when people give speeches, if they want them to be generally, broadly understood and appreciated, they give the speech in English. But I can't, but people who are from India and people who really know India well can listen to somebody speaking English in Parliament and say, he's a native Telugu speaker. His home language is Malayalam, right? And so on. Okay, so this is crucial for me because I want to argue that there are a number of practices and concepts that function as a koine. They allow a kind of communication and recognition among Muslims. This doesn't make it an essence, because there are Muslims who any one of these things that I'm going to talk about don't know or are unfamiliar with or just have decided are not important, right? But this is, again, a way of trying to explain why Islam's, plural, is a bad idea, because the fact is that the idea of plurality is balanced and controlled, among other things, by these koine cognates. And a cognate, by the way, is a word that's found in two languages, but that may mean something different in the languages. They allow recognition, but sometimes they're what are called faux amis. So, for example, association is both a French word and an English word, but entrepreneur means something different in French from what it means in English. And of course, Tony Blair said of George Bush II, you know what, the problem with these French people is they don't have any word for entrepreneur. Well, it's a French word, but George Bush did not know that. Okay, so let me sort of go ahead here. You can tell what their home language is. The koine belongs to the one who uses it, but not exclusively to him or her. So when you use it, you know, it has to be comprehensible to people who don't necessarily speak that language. All right, so the features of Islam that allow others to recognize one as Muslims are the koine elements of Islam, e.g., for example, the Quran. Right, I think most people would say, yeah, the Quran, this is kind of important for Muslims, whether they're in Indonesia or Morocco. Right, when you convert to Islam in the United States, one of the first things you do is you buy a Quran. Of course, you buy a Quran in English. Is that the Quran? That's an interesting question. But the Quran functions in many, many different ways. It is not just what's between the two covers, as I said before. It's what you understand to be between the two covers, but it's other things as well. So whether you're in Fez al-Bali, or whether you're in Cairo, or whether you're in certain parts of Samarkand, or whether you're in certain parts of Yogyakarta, you'll walk down the streets and you'll hear recitation of the Quran. Now, it's important to remember, again, most Muslims don't know Arabic, certainly not well enough to hear tajweed and understand what's going on. They may pick out words, Allah, for example, but what the Quran is also is a set of sounds that one grows up with that are a familiar soundscape to you. And they're a familiar soundscape to Moroccans, and they're a familiar soundscape to Indonesians. Likewise, it is a set of concepts that are studied mostly in other languages. Most Muslims understand the Quran in translation. So Turks, for example, there was a translation of the Quran into Turkish that was finally permitted in 1934, I think. First proposed in the 20s, anyway, 34 or something. And Turks have told me that it's incomprehensible because it's simply Turkish syntax with Arabic words. So now there are actually translations into Turkish that are comprehensible, but that, of course, make decisions like the one we were talking about with Fard al-Ain in trying to find a Turkish equivalent of an Arabic term. But most Muslims know the Quran to the extent they know its contents, right? Firstly, through translation. Nonetheless, Muslims are mostly committed to the idea that it is the icon of authority. If you're having a disagreement with somebody and you say, well, the Quran says this, what is not permissible is to say, well, I don't care what the Quran says, da-da-da-da-da. Right? The Quran has to be accommodated in discussions and conceptualizations of what it means to be a Muslim. Right? But, and here's the important thing, is it always requires reappropriation or appropriation. So even if, you've gone to school and you know what the Quran means, part of the interesting thing about the Quran, to use keep my academic distance, is that something will happen in your life and that will remind you of some particular Quranic phrase or concept. Or you'll hear a Quranic phrase and that suddenly makes sense of something for you. Right? That process is a process of appropriation because it very well might be that it doesn't have that significance for the other person who's listening. All the more so for the, 95% of the world's people world's Muslims who are not native speakers of Arabic, right? The Quran is meaningful for them, but it's meaningful when it's been filtered through Persian or some other language like that. So this is an important thing to recognize, is that even the Quran, it's there, it's a text, it's between two covers, is appropriated and reappropriated. And as I said the other day, it's often expanded. People will tell you very firmly that this thing is in the Quran that is not. And it's also shrunk because there are things in the Quran that people forget about, right? And part of the process of Islam's development is the discovery and rediscovery of the Quran itself. Another koine element is the Sunnah and the Hadith and the Prophet, and they're not the same thing. The Sunnah and the Hadith are a particularly literary form that requires a sound isnad at the beginning, and then a statement that is words are put into the mouth of the Prophet, right? This is what the Prophet said, or did, or allowed to happen. Now, most Muslims know some Hadith, but they know it in a kind of form as basically a story. So the Prophet did this, or the Prophet said that, right? How many people have the tools and skills to go, well, this is from so-and-so, Al-Bukhari reports this as being from so-and-so, as being from so-and-so, as reported from A and also from B, and da-da-da-da-da, and then it usually comes down to a single source who heard it from the Prophet. How many people have the tools to analyze that? I'm betting, even in this room of scholars, that not many of you would feel competent to do hardcore critical isnad analysis. But almost all of you probably know some hadith stories, some stories of the Prophet. And what many Muslims know as well are just stories that aren't even in the form of hadith. The Prophet was the kind of guy who would do this. The Prophet used to mend his own shoes, right? The Prophet would stand up when the funeral of a Muslim, a Christian or a Jew went by, right? That's just a story. So we talk about and we teach Islam as if hadith is, and it is, the second scripture of Islam, you might say, but that's not how most Muslims know it and deploy it and use it, right? In addition, however, and I should mention that, again, there are other means by which it's transmitted. So are you familiar with the Tablighi Jamaat, Tablighi Jamaat? You familiar with, are they in Morocco at all? They are in Morocco, interesting. So they are, of course, Indian origin, and they have a canonical text that you're required to memorize called Faza'il al-A'mal in Urdu, right? And so, again, this translation means that there's a kind of indigenization that takes place when you read these hadith. And for that reason, this book is banned in Saudi Arabia. The Tablighis are banned as well. I don't know, do people still know who Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is? He was a big deal in the world. Basketball player. He was arguably he still holds a lot of the records for scoring and stuff. But he was one of the pioneers of being a public Muslim. He was not, like Malcolm X or something like that, one of the Nation of Islam. He came out and faced a lot of problems, lost a lot of money by saying, I'm not Lou Alcindor anymore, I'm Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Well, he wrote an autobiography, he's written actually 2 or 3 of them now, but the one that interests me is he talks about his conversion to Islam. And he knew that he grew up Roman Catholic, but he thought that that was part of Christianity, which was associated with racism and slavery in America. He wasn't going to do that. So he became interested in Islam and looked around, and he met a man who was an authority on Islam called Khalis, if I remember. Khalis, I think, was his name. And he became a devotee of this man, Khalis, who explained Islam to him. Now, writing in retrospect, he said that there were a lot of kind of weird things about the Islam that this guy was teaching. Like, for example, when you did wudu, he said you scrubbed up like you were in a hospital, right? You washed your hands and your face, and you scrubbed up, and you washed your body, and you had hot water, and then you used alcohol, and it was just all of this, to become sterile in a kind of medical sense. And similarly, when he was told that in Islam you don't choose your wife, it's assigned to you, and this guy picked out a woman for him, and he said, I'm going to invite my parents to the wedding, and he said, no, Muslims, in Islam you can't have anybody who's not a Muslim at the wedding ceremony. And when he said, well, this is different from what other Muslims have told me, this guy, Khalis, told him, look, these are teachings that only the experts know. You really have to know the hadith to understand that this is how you do wudu, by pouring water over you and using it. And it's really only for the experts. Now, the thing about Karim Abdul-Jabbar is that he was an educated man, a smart man, and he actually then took Arabic classes one summer when he wasn't doing basketball. He was at Harvard in class with a friend of mine, actually. And she said he was a terrific student. He was so interested because, of course, it wasn't just he was learning Arabic so he could read the newspaper. He had become a Muslim. And what he discovered is that he could now look at the hadith collections, which were then not easily available in English, and it didn't say anything about this stuff. A lot of the stuff he was being taught was not in the Sunnah. It wasn't in fiqh books. And that led him to leave this man. But what I want to point out is that all throughout Islamic history, there have been people who quoted hadiths that proved some particular point that, as a historian or even within the confines of the study of hadith, were not authentic. So we have Mahdis who appear all over, Mahdis who appear in North Africa, for example, quoting hadith that say, there will be a man who comes from X and he will save the remnant of my people. There'll be a man from Y and he will be the Mahdi who leads my people to paradise. Now, it turns out that those aren't in the Kutub al-Sitta, they aren't in the Bihar al-Anwar, they aren't in any collection of hadith. But it's great because at least most people don't know about this. The hadith is so big. I mean, who could say they know everything that's in the Kutub al-Sitta? And so you could have a hadith that says, Professor Reinhart is a great guy, and, some ignorant person might believe that. So the point I want to make then is that Muslims are committed to seeing acts and statements of the Prophet as normative. But again, the way that they acquire them is through means other than the technical methods. In addition, there's a kind of image of the Prophet, and the biographies of the Prophet over time change a lot. So the earliest biographies of the Prophet are about him as a war leader. They're the Kutub al-Maghazi. And those are the earliest biographies that we have. But then later we get stories of him in different ways, and in the contemporary world we get the image of the Prophet or the prophets as, for example, liberation fighters. They were from humble backgrounds, they struggled against the upper class, and they finally liberated their people from oppression, right? That's not an image of the Prophet that would be popular in all countries in Islamdom. Or would strike a chord, but for people who are fighting for liberation in South Africa or in Iran under the Shah, those images of the Prophet were very potent. In India, there were popular biographies that described the Prophet as the light of the four Vedas, right? That he's a mystical figure in which the wisdom of the four Vedas are incarnated, and he becomes a kind of divinity on earth, right? Who came to bring enlightenment to Muslims. And we can, all of you must be familiar with lots and lots of biographies of the Prophet or stories of the Prophet where he's presented as a feminist or as a communist or whatever. I mean, I certainly, when I first went to Egypt, there was a lot of stuff about how Islam was a form of ishtirakiyya, and essentially the Prophet was kind of like Lenin, right? So, and this was embraced by some Europeans. Rodin-Son, for example, a great French scholar of Islam, presents the Prophet as basically a sort of Marxist hero. But whatever we might say, he is a touchstone of Muslim authority. People admit that if you can find a definitive account of the Prophet saying this or doing that, that's to be taken seriously. And so if a Muslim is having an argument with, and this happens a lot, with an Iranian with a Saudi, for example, at an American university, they both are going to offer the Prophet as proof of their point, right? So again, we can tell where the person is coming from by the kind of image of the Prophet that they're attached to. And that's what makes the Prophet a figure in Koine Islam. My particular interest just now, I'm writing a survey, an overview of ibadat, and I'm particularly interested in ritual. And the so-called 5 pillars of Islam are what people will often refer to as the essence of Islam or whatever. I want to argue that it's the most potent of the Koine elements of Islam. And this has to do with the nature of ritual, but also with the nature of the Islamic rituals. I want to draw here on the work of an anthropologist, 2 anthropologists actually, Sally Humphreys and James Laidlaw, who were trying to understand the rituals of the Jainas. What is a ritual? What is it that's special about a ritual? And the word is used loosely all the time. Every morning I brush my teeth, that's my ritual at the beginning of the day. Well, all right, fine, anything you do habitually, but that's not really a ritual. Again, it's a very complicated argument. If you're interested, I wrote pretty extensively about it. I'd be happy to send you a copy of, another article that's about terminology and concepts. But they sum up the idea that a ritual is a unique kind of act which is grounded in what they call the intention not to intend, intending not to intend. And this works really well, particularly for thinking about salat. That is to say, you decide, okay, it's time to pray, and you sort of prepare yourself, and you may need to do wudu, and you sort of brush off your clothes, and you get yourself into a frame of mind, and then either you say or think, right, I intend to perform salat al-duhr, right? What happens then? What happens then is that your intention is given over, and what you do next, right, is a script, as it were, that comes from somewhere else or someone else. So when you go through the salat, you are not winging it, right? And I'm interested in what causes salat to fail. And it's almost always the assertion of the person's will into the salat script. So if instead of subhanallah you say al-majd laka, for example, the prayer is voided, right? If you decide, I'm really in a groove, I'm going to do an extra ruk'ah, the prayer is voided, right? Anything that really is your own intention is locked out because it's the intention that God has imposed or that is modeled by the Prophet or whatever. It is a script that is the performance of salat. Now, there are some moments of choice, you might say, in that you get to choose which verses you recite, but even that is scripted. You can't decide, I'm going to recite from Khalil Gibran or from Mutanabbi or something like that, right? It's only ever Quran that you can recite. And generally, most people have a small set of verses that they use. Right? And this is, again, all the more so because remember, the overwhelming majority of the world's Muslims don't know Arabic. So we had a woman who worked for us, as I may have mentioned, in Turkey, who was the first person I knew who prayed faithfully. And at noon, she would go off into a little errand, she would do wudu, and then she would, and what she recited, I'm sure, would be incomprehensible to an Arab. She always, in retrospect, I know that one of the things she did was Surat al-Ikhlas. I don't think any of you, if you just heard a tape recording of it, would recognize what was going on. But she always recited those words, and it was important that they were Arabic words from the Quran, because she couldn't recite Yunus Emre, for example. Right? So this is the intention not to intend, and it's an unnatural act. We don't do many things in our lives, especially moderns, don't do many things in their lives where their intention is not paramount. Right? Think about your day. It's all governed by your will. You decide, I'm going to get up at 6, and then I think I'll go have a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to brush my teeth. And, you know, okay, you could say I brush my teeth because the dentist tells me to brush my teeth, but do you go on the left or the right? Do you use the toothbrush or do you floss? All of these things are your will imposed. But a ritual is one of the very few cases where you suspend your will. Now, the reason I point this out is because, again, people who study ritual point out that discourse is always, you know, hi, how are you, and so on, is always uncertain in its sincerity. Right? Simple example, if I say, how are you, do I really care? Or am I just being nice? Or am I just being what you need to be? Right? Whereas the question of sincerity doesn't enter into the ritual, because if you've performed the ritual correctly, the argument goes, this is the one space in the world that has no ambiguity. Right?
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know you, but me. I pray 5 times a day. The intention is there, the sincerity is there, and the creativity is there. If I decide to do qunut, I will do it, and I will be if I decide to, towards the end, to say things that I can't say in Arabic and I will say them in English, I will, because I'm praying for something, for someone, for a situation.
After you say Salaam alaikum wa, after you've said the taslim.
But even if I am praying and I am not present and I don't feel what I'm doing, there's a mechanic, if you want to call it this way, of Allah Akbar, etc. You go down, you go up, you do whatever you want. But the point is, I pray sitting down because I have a knee problem, big scar. I can't, do sujood, so I sit down. But there's a freedom. The freedom is from the heart. There is, you want to call it ritual, but if you are not present, if you are not your salah is void. Because you are not there. It is not Kenza praying, me praying, and Zakaria praying, and Yusuf praying. It's not the same thing. From outside, it might look, we're saying the same thing, we're going down at the same time. But it's me, it's my intention, it's
But you're misunderstanding the term.
Your heart is
intention.
present.
So niyyah is when you commit yourself to follow
more
the
than
script.
niyyah.
Well, so
when you pray, I think. I don't know. Afwan.
So
I don't mean to.
All I'm saying is this: of course, you have to be present. You can't be thinking about football or whatever. It's the suspension of the self that makes you present. So, in other words, if you're thinking about the situation in Ukraine, at least both in the literature of mysticism and in the literature of fiqh, then your prayer is void. If you add to the ritual, your prayer is void. Now, if at the end you want to do awrad or whatever, great, that's all great. And dua is another question entirely. But salat is a scripted activity that does not leave space for you to, whether you're reading Ibn Arabi on prayer or whatever, it's not something that you are free to improvise.
No, I agree. You're not going to bring in, just one sec. You're not going to bring in, Ukraine or people dying. But the whole point is to make a void of yourself and to be one
Right.
with God.
Right, and at that point, the point is that it is these acts and this state is not your normal present state in the world. It is an exceptional state that doesn't happen elsewhere. And that's what is remarkable about these rituals. So do we want to take questions, or shall I go?
Yes, keep going.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So the action then is necessarily sincere because it doesn't have these ambiguities which are present in all of our other discourse and acts. But it is nonetheless a shared action, and there are physiological reasons why shared actions lead to sort of a different and intense state. For example, studies have shown that if people are rowing together in competitive rowing, they have a higher threshold of pain than they do if they're rowing just by themselves. Right? We get reinforcement, and there's a complicated reason for this that has to do with the structure of the brain, with mirror neurons and so on. But the point is that praying together, or imagining yourself praying together, creates a state that is otherwise unique in our lives. And so the shared action creates a distinctive environment. And here's the point, is that they argue, and I think it's completely true, that the weirdness of this, the uniqueness of one's prayer, of the ritual state, demands interpretation, right? More than other acts. Why do I drink water? That's not a problem. I mean, I suppose it's because I'm thirsty, or I want to pause, or whatever. But ritual acts demand the imagination try and figure out what's going on. And as such, that, profoundly, profoundly moves one to think about the kind of larger context in which the act is taking place. So the thing about ritual is the ritual is stable, right? I honestly think that if Omar ibn al-Khattab joined you all at noon prayer today, that he would recognize what's going on. He would probably, it would be very close, if not the same thing, to what you guys are doing, right? And that is a particular feature of ritual because it's a scripted act, right? Fortunately, people can't improvise, and it remains stable. But the interpretation is highly unstable, and it's dynamic. So to give you a better example of all of this, I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the Hajj is about, right? And both from the earliest period and right through to the present. Why do people go on the Hajj, right? The only Quranic reference seems to be that it's an act of obedience, and there's a reference to God's house. Now, what exactly that means, I mean, God is in a certain sense everywhere, so God's house is a, but it signifies anyway some particular significance of the Kaaba. But when we look at the accounts of pilgrims, they often say, well, or they often, especially in the pre-modern period, they would say things like, well, I did the Hajj because it was a chance to see Eve's tomb, which was in Jeddah. So we have accounts of Malay pilgrims, for example, who said that they went to see Eve's tomb. Or it's a chance to see the graves of important Muslims, and that going to Medina is actually more important than going to Mecca, right? Whatever it may be the rules. Al-Ghazali describes it as a rehearsal for the day of resurrection, that you're wearing, the ihram, and so you're like, all the bodies will be on the day of resurrection. When they rise from the grave, they'll be standing before God as you stand at Jebel Rahmah, right? And you wait to hear what your fate. So it's to remind you of the day of resurrection. We have 400 years of evidence that the Bedouin in Arabia understood the Hajj as a moment when you were married to the Kaaba, right? That, you know how the kiswa, the black kiswa, is usually lifted up and then there's a sort of white kiswa underneath it. And that's the Kaaba lifting her skirts as one does in marriage, right? So they have a whole formulated, and this was going on into the 20th century, but we have accounts of it as early as the 1400s. There's the Malcolm X thing, which is the diversity of Islam. You go and you see all these people who are blonde and black and redheaded and so on and so forth, and you're confronted with the fact that the world is diverse and yet we're all Muslims. But if you actually read Malcolm X's account, it's also about treating a brother right. He's an African American who's used to segregation, he's used to bad treatment, and he's put in a room where he says the bathroom was as big as the size of a bedroom at the Hotel Ritz in New York. He's driven around in a private car, and he goes into all of these details to show that the Muslims doing the Hajj had respect for him despite the fact that he was black, right? So there's several accounts that are along these lines as well. There's another account which many Muslims have reported to me, the sort of lost in a crowd phenomenon, again, Durkheimian thing, collective effervescence, the feeling that your own ego disappears in the now millions of people who come, right, and with whom you share these rituals. Again, that's like rowing together or singing together or whatever, that this is a moment when your own self is lost in the crowd. Let's see, are we? Oh, okay, there we go. I had my students ask people who went on the Hajj what the Hajj was about. And one account was that they had a mystical union with God, that you are in a certain sense, possibly when you do these rituals, you are closer to God and you have more possibility for union with God, right? Also, that it is a renewal of faith, that if you've neglected the obligations that are on you as a Muslim, that it's kind of like giving up alcohol in a certain sense. You renew your faith by cleaning up, by going through this process that is, signifies your change. And there are other accounts that, I forget how I set this up. Sigh. Right, that we have a number of West Africans who go and say that it's a trial, it's a test, because if you're poor and you're coming from West Africa, the Saudis all try and cheat you, and you get into crowds and you could fall over and die. So it's a literal test, and if you survive, then all of your sins are forgiven and you're like a baby. But the point is that, like all of these koine elements, you're shaped by the by the framework and expectation that you bring to it. You appropriate that Hajj. So one person's explanation of or experience of the Hajj is going to differ from another's. And yet, if a Muslim says of someone else that he's a Haji or she's a Hajia, then that matters, and that puts them together even if they're from Detroit and from, let's say, Tetuan. So there are other cognates as well, which we don't have time to go into, but the concept of Sharia, the idea that there is a right way to do things, is shared by many Muslims, although again the content of it is quite different. And there's not enough empirical work on this, but I know of work done in Bujad here, where Shra is the right way to do things. So, yes, praying when you're summoned by the muezzin is part of Shra, but also so is women not riding bicycles, right? That's also against the Shra. And I think there's nothing about bicycles in most fiqh works. Most importantly, I think Islam itself as a concept is a cognate that Muslims share with other Muslims. Again, what is Islam? We'll get as many answers as we ask people. I'm sure this group would offer a number of different answers. One thing to point out, however, historically, is that I signify it with a small I here. The use of the term Islam in the, with one possible exception, is not a brand name. It is a verbal noun. It means to basically, it's not passive, it's to turn around and embrace something. The only usages we have in early Arabic are about, of the fourth form of in poetry, you're being chased by somebody who's after you, you turn around and engage with that thing. Right? So it's not passive, it's not submitting, it's not, that seems to be the early sense, and so it needs to be understood as a verbal noun. But over time it becomes a brand name, and by the 19th century it's this thing, and in Maududi and in Sayyid Qutb, it's a nizam, right? And it's the idea of a nizam. It's modeled on particularly Marxian ideas of what, how society works or should work, right? But the important thing to recognize here is that for our purposes in trying to understand, well, how Islam works, what is Islam, it's that the acts and the commitment to concepts is more important than the interpretations or beliefs. On any one of these things, this is what academics do, is you can find interpretations all over. And we do that without recognizing that the interpretations are secondary to the acts. Yes, of course, if you're going to pray, you have to think that there's somebody called God that has the right to tell you to do that. But honestly, I know a number of Muslims who go pray, who fast Ramadan, and tell you they don't believe in God. Right? I know lots of Jews who do Passover and so on and so forth who say they don't believe in God, but I'm a Jew, what do I do? So I know Muslims who are similar. What matters, though, is the commitment to these acts, to doing them as somehow transcendentally important, and that at least you believe that you ought to be doing them. No one of them is crucial. There's actually work on what is it that is necessary to believe. What is it that if you don't do that, you're a Muslim? And this was a kind of poll in Sudan. You can neglect everything. But if you say there's no requirement to fast, in the view of the people that this guy asked, you're not a Muslim anymore. Now, I don't know what would be the case in Morocco. It's an interesting question. So, yes, lots of people cheat during Ramadan. But if you walk down the street eating a sandwich and saying, I don't have to do that, right? Then, in the view of at least one group of Muslims, you've turned your back on it. But notice it's not fasting, it's not belief. I mean, it's not some idea, it's not some belief, right? If you don't believe, for some Christians, if you don't believe that Christ died for your sins, you're not a Christian. It's not about belief, it's about practice, right? And practices and rituals have this peculiar power. They are rare things and increasingly rare in the modern world. As Mary Douglas points out, this is a world that thinks of ritual, as you seem to, for example, as meaning merely ritual, just acts, right? Which is what people who don't believe in ritual think ritual means, right? And anthropologists use it for the way that horses greet each other and so on and so forth. They call those ritual activities. But certainly Islamic practice is rich with ritual moments, and those I think are important. So Koine Islam then creates bonds among Muslims. It creates solidarity and identity, right? And it helps cultivate experience. It shapes experience, but not in absolutely predictable ways, right? And so this is partially my answer to why we don't want to talk about Islams. Yes, Egyptians may understand something different when we talk about the Prophet than South African Muslims do. But nonetheless, they're talking about Muhammad and not about, Frederick Engels, right? And this is important, right? When they talk about some local figure, right? If the figure's religious and its religiosity is important, then great. That you might say is some kind of local understanding, some kind of dialect version of Islam. But when you talk about Muhammad, it seems to me you've moved beyond the possibility of dialect. But, this is the crucial thing, it's always appropriated in some way that's shaped by local experience. Right? So, intending not to intend is important, the demand for interpretation is important, and these particular features, which I think are certainly Islamic and in some ways peculiarly Islamic or uniquely Islamic, go far to help create the thing that many of you thought was being argued for yesterday, which is that anything goes and Muslims everywhere are different and so on. And the argument is quite the contrary, that with all of this pluralism and space for difference and of interpretation, nonetheless, there are these core elements, right? These practices, these issues, these koine concepts and practices that are very important in the construction of what we call Islam. Now, there's one other component that I'll be talking about tomorrow, again using linguistic terminology. We'll talk about standard Islam, which is basically the Islam of the ulama and how it functions. But so far, this is, we have two elements then. We have the diversity and variability of Muslims, and we have the shared practices that help construct a community of self-recognition. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin Reinhart. I mean, I guess we need some break.